May 1845, two ships sailed out of England carrying 129 men and enough food for 3 years. They were the best-equipped Arctic expedition ever launched. Reinforced hulls, steam engines, a library of 1,000 books, silver cutlery for the officers. 2 months later, they were seen tied to an iceberg in Baffin Bay, and then every single man aboard them vanished. It would take more than 170 years to find them. Welcome to Shadow Archives. By 1845, the Northwest Passage had obsessed European explorers for almost 4 centuries. A sea route to the frozen top of North America that promised a shortcut between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Britain had been chasing it for generations at enormous cost in ships and lives, and the British Admiralty believed they were finally close. The 2 ships chosen were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They were not ordinary vessels. They had already survived an expedition to Antarctica. Their hulls were reinforced with iron to break through ice. They carried steam engines salvaged from locomotives, internal heating systems, and 3 years of tin food on paper. They were a technological marvel, the safest ships ever to enter the Arctic. Command was given to Sir John Franklin. He was 59 years old, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, and 3 previous Arctic expeditions. On one of those earlier journeys, he had survived starvation by boiling and eating his own leather boots, earning him the grim nickname the man who ate his boots. He was not the Admiralty's first choice, but he wanted the command, and he got it. The expedition departed on May 19, 1845. It sailed up the coast of Greenland and into Baffin Bay, at the entrance to the Arctic archipelago. On July 28th, 2 whaling ships, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, encountered Erebus and Terror moored to an iceberg, waiting for conditions to cross into the passage. The crew spoke briefly. The men were healthy, confident, well-supplied. It was the last time any European would ever see them alive. What happened next had to be reconstructed, piece by piece. Over more than a century, the ship spent their first winter at Beechey Island, where 3 crew members died and were buried. The following summer, they sailed south through Peel Sound, and then off the northwest coast of King William Island. In September 1846, the ice closed around them. It did not let go. For a year and a half, Erebus and Terror sat locked in the pack ice, unable to move. The men lived aboard the trapped ships through 2 brutal Arctic winters. Temperatures fell far below anything they had prepared for. The tin food, sealed with lead solder, was slowly poisoning them. Scurvy set in, and one by one, the men began to die. By the spring of 1848, Sir John Franklin was dead. So were 8 other officers and 15 men. The survivors, 105 of them, now led by Captain Francis Crozier, made a decision. They would abandon the ships. They would walk south across the ice and the frozen tundra, hauling lifeboats loaded with supplies, toward a distant trading post hundreds of miles away. It was their only chance. Before they left, they did one thing. On King William Island, they left a note inside a stone cairn. It was written on a standard Admiralty form. The first part, dated 1847, ended with the words, "All well." But in the margins, a second message had been added 11 months later. It read, "Sir John Franklin died on June 11th, 1847. The ships abandoned, 24 dead, and the survivors setting out the next day." The march south was a death sentence. The men were already weakened by scurvy, starvation, and lead poisoning. They were dragging heavy wooden boats across broken ice, in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. They wore wool and flannel, not the fur that the Inuit knew was the only thing that worked. They were, in the most literal sense, walking to their deaths, and every one of them did. For 6 years, Britain heard nothing. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, refused to accept that her husband was gone. She used her own fortune and relentless political pressure to launch search expedition after search expedition. In total, more than 30 missions went looking for Franklin. They found scattered bones, abandoned equipment, 3 graves on Beachy Island, but no survivors, no ships, no answers. Then, in 1854, a Scottish explorer named John Ray was surveying the Arctic coast for the Hudson's Bay Company. Near Pelly Bay, he met a group of Inuit. Through an interpreter, they told him something extraordinary. They described a party of around 40 white men who had died of starvation near the mouth of a great river years earlier. They had seen the men, they had seen the bodies, and they described what the bodies showed. The Inuit told Ray that the final survivors had resorted to cannibalism. They had seen the cut marks on the bones, the bodies in the cooking kettles. It was the only way the last men had stayed alive as long as they did. The Inuit also showed Ray objects, silver forks and spoons, engraved with the initials of Franklin's officers. There was no longer any doubt. This was the fate of the expedition. When John Ray brought this report back to Britain, it was not met with grief. It was met with fury. The Victorian public could not accept that British naval officers, gentlemen Christians, representatives of the Empire, could have eaten each other. The idea was an obscenity. And the man who led the attack on Ray's report was one of the most famous writers in the world, Charles Dickens. Dickens wrote 2 long essays denouncing Ray. He attacked the reliability of the Inuit, calling their account, in words that are difficult to read today, the vague babble of savages. He suggested the Inuit themselves might have murdered Franklin's men. He insisted that an Englishman would never resort to cannibalism. Dickens was wrong on every count, but he was famous, and Ray was not. Ray's reputation never recovered. In 1859, a search expedition financed by Lady Franklin found the Victory Point note in its cairn, the only written record ever recovered from the expedition. It confirmed the broad outline, but the deeper truth, the truth the Inuit had told from the beginning, was still being denied. For more than a century, the Inuit testimony was treated as unreliable, as legend, as the stories of people the Empire refused to believe. It took until the 21st century to prove the Inuit had been right all along. In the 1980s and 1990s, scientists exhumed the graves on Beachy Island and analyzed bones found on King William Island. They found high levels of lead. They found the unmistakable cut marks of cannibalism on nearly a quarter of the remains, exactly as the Inuit had described to John Ray in 1854. And then came the ships themselves. For over 160 years, no one knew where Erebus and Terror had finally sunk, but the Inuit had always said the wrecks were in specific places the searchers had dismissed. In 2014, a Canadian expedition, working with Inuit knowledge, found HMS Erebus on the seafloor. It was almost exactly where the Inuit oral tradition had said it would be. 2 years later, in 2016, they found HMS Terror. Both wrecks were remarkably preserved by the cold Arctic water, drawers still closed, cabinets intact. The Inuit had been right about the cannibalism. They had been right about the starvation. They had been right about where the ships went down. They had been right about everything. For over a century, while the most powerful empire on Earth refused to listen. There's still one mystery left. The Victory Point note said 105 men set out to march south in 1848. But the Inuit testimony suggests that some of them may have lived far longer than anyone believed, that small groups survived for years, that some may have returned to the ships, that the story did not end on that frozen march. The drawers of HMS Terror, sealed in silt and ice, have not yet been fully opened. The Franklin expedition is often told as a story of British heroism against the merciless Arctic, brave men defeated by an unconquerable wilderness. But that is not quite the real story. The real story is that the men who died had everything the Empire could give them, the best ships, the best equipment, 3 years of food, and still died because they refused to learn from the people who survived in that landscape for thousands of years. The Inuit wore fur because fur worked. They ate fresh meat because it prevented scurvy. They traveled light and moved with the seasons. Franklin's men wore wool, ate poisoned tin food, and dragged silver cutlery and 1,000 books across the ice. They had the knowledge to survive all around them, and the people they considered beneath them, they simply would not take it. John Ray, the one man who listened to the Inuit, who brought back the truth, who was destroyed for telling it, was never honored in his lifetime the way other Arctic explorers were. He was right. He paid for being right. It would take more than 150 years for history to acknowledge that the vague babble Dickens dismissed was, in fact, the most accurate account anyone ever produced. "129 men sailed into the Arctic in 1845 and never came home. Their bones are still scattered across King William Island. Their ships rest on the seafloor, slowly being explored, drawer by frozen drawer. And somewhere in those sealed cabinets may be the documents that finally answer the question that has lasted nearly 2 centuries. Not how they died, but how long some of them managed to live. The Northwest Passage that Franklin died trying to find is open today. Climate change has melted the ice that trapped Erebus and Terror. Ships now sail through it every summer. The route that cost 129 lives, now an ordinary shipping lane. The Arctic that killed them is disappearing. And the Inuit, whose knowledge was dismissed for over a century, are the ones now helping to map what remains. Next file. A ship found drifting in the Atlantic with full sails, a full cargo, and not a single soul aboard. The mystery of the Mary Celeste. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Subscribe and unlock the archives. New file every week. I will see you in the next one.